ποικιλόθρονα θάνατα φρόδιτα, πεδίος δολόπλοκε.
And we're talking about archaic Greek poetry. The last time we were together, we talked some about the period of time in which archaic Greek poetry arose, and about a couple of the earliest poets of archaic Greek period, including Homer and Hesiod. And what I want to talk about today is three poets that come after Homer. They wrote in the 7th century and on into the early 6th century. The first is named Archilochus, and Archilochus is a little earlier than the other two. He is basically mid-7th century BCE. And then Alcaios and Sappho. We'll get to those in a moment. Let me talk about Archilochus first. Archilochus, I think, is a great person to look at to get a sense of what Greek culture at this period, 7th century BCE, is like. Archilochus lived on a couple of different islands in the eastern Mediterranean between what we think of as Greece and what we think of as Turkey. He spent much of his life as a warrior. And this is a period when city-states had not kind of fully settled out into the form that they take in classical Greece. And Archilochus's poetry shows you what was valued by people like him. So let me read you just a couple. This poem is fragment number 7, and with archaic poets we talk about fragments because nobody kept a full record of what any of these people wrote, and they've been assembled, the works of these poets have been assembled from little bits and pieces quoted by other people into a collection of what we have. So this fragment number 7, he says, "One sizable thing I know, how to get back my own with a man doing me wrong." There's a little sense of Archilochus. And here's another. "I am two things, a fighter who follows the master of battles," and that's spoken of as a god, the master of battles, "and one who understands the gift of the muses' love." The muses being those who inspire poetry. So when the muses love you, that's the gift of the muses' love, right? When you become a poet. But that goes hand in hand for Archilochus with being one who follows the master of battles. Another one that he wrote. "I don't like the towering captain with the spraddly length of leg, one who swaggers in his love locks and clean shaves beneath the chin. Give me a man short and squarely set upon his legs, a man full of heart, not to be shaken from the place he plants his feet." Another sense of Archilochus there. I'm going to read one or two more. Try this one. This is fragment 10. "Some barbarian is waving my shield, since I was obliged to leave that perfectly good piece of equipment behind under a bush. But I got away, so what does it matter? Let the shield go. I can buy another one, equally good." So Archilochus is a man who learned how to come away from a losing battle as well as away from a winning one. And I'm going to read one more. A little bit longer one. This is fragment 12. "Heart, my heart, so battered with misfortune far beyond your strength, up and face the men who hate us. Bare your chest to the assault of the enemy and fight them off. Stand fast among the beam-like spears. Give no ground, and if you beat them, do not brag in open show, nor, if they beat you, run home and lie down on your bed and cry." So, in other words, keep the balance. Don't be too excited about winning and don't be too upset about losing. "Keep some measure in the joy you take in luck and the degree you give way to sorrow. All our life is up and down like this." So that's a sense of Archilochus. His great loves in life are the battle that he's in and the men that he fights those battles with, who are who are brothers in arms and sometimes lovers and people that he cares most about in the world. And he cares about expressing what he knows and learns in words that are beautiful. You might remember that the last time we talked about this sense of loss that drives Greek poetry. I think you see some of that in Archilochus. He's a man who is at the point that he's writing in a place where he doesn't quite have a grip on home, where he recognizes that there will be constant loss and constant sorrow, that you can't take it too seriously, and yet you don't just dismiss it either. The pain is there. He thinks about that shield he left under the bush, but he lets it go. Alcaius, the second of the poets I wanted to talk about today, similarly was a man involved in battle. In fact, he spent a good deal of his life in exile, and he and his brother were the leaders of an army that was coming back to try to take back the island that he considered his home. And the folks at home were fighting him off. So Alcaius is truly a person who is away from home, has lost his home, and a person of battle, kind of the way Archilochus is, but perhaps more so. One of the things that Alcaius is known for is the meter in which he writes. He writes in a meter that came to be known as the Alcaian meter, named for him. And Tennyson wrote something that was in that meter. So I'm going to read you a little bit of the Tennyson, not for the content, but just so you get a sense of the rhythm that Alcaius writes in. And so this is Tennyson. O mighty-mouthed inventor of harmonies, O skilled to sing of time or eternity, God-gifted organ voice of England, Milton, a name to resound for ages. So it's a dun da da dun da da dun da dun dun is kind of Alcaeus's meter. It's complex, incredibly difficult to write it in English. Tennyson is probably the only person who's really attempted it at any length. But one that kind of carries a rocking sense that almost has a feel of the ocean in it. Alcaeus wrote this: I cannot understand how the winds are set against each other. Now from this side and now from that the waves roll. We between them run with the wind in our black ship driven, hard-pressed and laboring under the giant storm. All round the mast-step washes the sea we shipped. You can see through the sail already, where there are opening rents within it. The forestays slacken. Do you know that metaphor of the ship of state that Walt Whitman uses it when he talks about Captain, My Captain, when he writes the poem about Lincoln. And you've seen it all over the place in many other things you've read, I'm sure, that the idea that we can talk about a country as a ship sailing on the sea. Well, that metaphor comes to us first in Alcaeus. Alcaeus spoke of his own country as being a ship of state that was on stormy seas. So he was both a sailor himself, right, heading a navy coming back to take back his island, or a small force of boats, and also, as a poet, one who described his own state as being a ship on a stormy sea. When he says in that poem, I cannot understand how the winds are set against each other, think about what it's like to be in a country where you don't quite understand why the winds are blowing the direction that they are, or why the battle keeps turning one way or another, or ideas keep fighting against one another. And when he says, now from this side, and now from that, the waves roll, that's the storm where it keeps storming up in a different direction than you expected. We, between them, because we're always between them, We between them run with the wind in our black ship driven, hard pressed, and laboring under the giant storm. It's a good description of the time and the place in which Alcaius struggled as a political person, as well as a soldier. The sense of loss we talked about in the last time we were together. I talked about Greeks being driven by a sense of loss that comes in part from their awareness of that history of ages before them that comes to them through mythological sources, through patterns in Homer and Hesiod, as well as no doubt from artifacts and things like that that reminded them of a time that came before what they were aware of. And the sense of loss that comes from the geography and the geology of the place where they are, the sense that they were driven to colonize, and therefore many Greeks were always away from home or had a sense of missing the place where they belonged. The geology of the place where they lived, of being on a tenuous strip between the mountains and the sea. All of that drives this sense of loss. And you can see it in Alcaeus too, as he's driven by the sense of loss of the home that should be. And where is he? Not at home, but on this stormy sea, both a metaphorical stormy sea and a real one. Before we turn to Sappho, I'm going to talk about that sense of loss a little bit more. C.S. Lewis, a British writer of the 20th century, used a word, Sehnsucht. And Sehnsucht in German means fiery longing. But Lewis used it to describe a sort of joy, kind of. What he was describing was that way that you feel when you have just become aware that you were in a powerful state of joy. What he said was that we experience joy when we have what we would today call flow, when you are completely embedded in the thing that you're doing and you feel at home in it and you feel like you're at your peak performance and you feel everything is right and you have this intense sense of joy. Only you're not aware that you have it. You're just in it. So Lewis says we experience that, and then as soon as we observe it, it goes away. And then we feel Sehnsucht. Then we feel this fiery longing. So we look back on things that are just out of reach. We can't hold on to them. We're aware of what we had before and that now it's gone. That longing is, I think, a lot of what drives these Greek poets. That sense of something that you had and that you don't have now, and that's just out of reach. So think about Alcaeus, a homeland just out of reach. The joy of putting the words about that into poetry, into a finely tuned expression of the puzzlement, a finely tuned expression of I cannot understand how the winds are set against each other. Now from this side and now from that, the waves roll. To express that sense of things not being as they should be, but express it perfectly, that's archaic Greek poetry. I want to read one more little bit of Alcaeus. Alcaeus used another metaphor that I like a lot. He said that there were ways of looking through another person. And he uses a word that it's like the Greek word for mirror, something that you look into and see yourself, but he used a tele prefix with it to mean a way of looking through someone else instead of looking at yourself in a mirror, to look through someone else. And he said wine, for example, was a way of looking through another person. But he uses that word in connection with poetry too, that as we read poetry together, we have ways of looking through each other. And so when he says in this poem that something about wine, think about that. He says, "We must not let our spirits give way to grief by being sorry that we get no further on." In other words, by being sorry that we're stuck here in the middle of the storm. Best of all defenses, he says, is to mix plenty of wine and drink it. Now remember, he's not saying that the best of all defenses when we're here in the middle of the storm is to drink the wine and become oblivious. He says the best of all defenses together is to drink plenty of wine, in other words, the ways of looking through one another, and drink that. When Alcaius writes of being on the stormy sea, or being in a battle, or puzzlement over the ship of state, the solution is to be with one another and look through and know one another. The third poet I wanted to talk about is a contemporary of Alcaius, wrote at exactly the same time, and very close geographically to where Alcaius lived, and her name is Sappho. Sappho is, of course, unusual because she is the only one of the archaic Greek poets that we have preserved who was female. Was she the only woman writing? Probably not. Certainly not. But she's the only one that we have preserved. And that's kind of true of classical literature in general, that we have very, very few women's writings preserved. So when we do, it's kind of interesting to pay particular attention to them and see what's different about what a female writer does compared to a male writer in the same kinds of times and places. We believe that Sappho also spent some time in exile, as Alcaius did. But she's not the admiral leading the navy back. In fact, her husband probably had kind of that role in the return from exile at one point. What we see in Sappho is instead a different set of concerns. Sappho writes, again, about longing, about things that are just out of reach. She writes about love, love for the women that she spends time with, love for her friends, love for what seem to be young women students, young women she spent time with, love for men, love for a way of life that may be slipping out of her reach. All through those, though, we always see this very, very sharp observation, and we see that sense of longing, that Sehnsucht, that things being just out of reach. I want to talk about one particular word in Sappho. This comes from fragment 130 of Sappho. By the way, Sappho's writings were preserved for us in these fragments of archaic poetry, just like Alcaius or Archilochus, and they survived the Middle Ages in exactly one text. We're very fortunate that we have any of Sappho, really. I want to talk about this word glucopikron. This is a word that appears in Sappho, fragment 130. And the gluco part on it means sweet. It's the root word of glucose. And the pikron part, you can hear that little sharpness to it. So glucopikron is sweet sharp or sweet bitter. And it reflects the idea that an experience can be both sweet and painful at the same time. The poet Anne Carson, in her book Eros the Bittersweet, deals at length with this word, and you might be interested in going and reading that. And one of the things that she notes is that in poetry, in Greek poetry, love is not something that is static. It's something that is a verb that's moving, that, like when we talked about Sehnsucht earlier, by the time you notice it, it's out of reach. And as such, it is something that the experience of it is both entirely sweet and painful at the same time. That sort of ethos, I think, pervades the work of Sappho. I think you see that glucopikron not just in her fragment 130, but in much of her discussion about love. We're going to look at one of her most well-known poems today, and this is Sappho fragment 31, and it's been a poem that has been very influential both to ancient Roman poets 1,000 years almost after Sappho, and all the way through the history of English poetry, and we'll look at some of that impact as we go forward as well. Fragment 31 begins with these. Actually, before I tell you the words, I think I want to talk about the situation first, because the situation is one that I know you'll recognize. It's a totally universal situation. There are three people. Two of them are sitting close to each other. One's a man and one's a woman. And the third person is the poet. And the poet is looking from outside or across a room or at some sort of psychological distance at these two people. It's a situation you've seen in movies. It's a situation you probably saw in your high school cafeteria. It is a universal situation. One person looks across at the other two and feels both desire and the pleasure of that desire and pain at the same time. Glucopikron. In this poem, in Sappho's version, she depicts a young woman, someone she knows, sitting with a man, and she says that that man is so lucky. And I think you can hear the tone of jealousy, perhaps, in that, the wish to be where he is, talking to this young woman. What would you feel in your body when you feel that kind of jealousy? When you're looking at someone you would like to be talking to, and someone else is there instead? What are the sensations that you feel physically? That's part of the universal. I think that Sappho's jealousy of this man who's talking to the young woman could be a sexual jealousy. It could also be a jealousy that's based on, I love talking to this girl and I would like to be talking to her and I can't be because she's going to go off and marry this guy or something, and she's no longer going to be part of my circle. Or any kind of that sense of loss coming into this situation, seeing the person you're losing going away with someone else. So what physical sensations do we get when that happens? Ever feel it in your throat? Feel butterflies in your stomach? Feel heat? Feel a flush? Feel anger? What do you feel when you feel that? Here's how Sappho describes it. She says, first of all, phainatai moi kenos isos teoisin. She says, he seems, and that phainatai is the same word that's at the root word of our word phenomenon. He seems to me, phainatai moi. So there she is at the very beginning of the poem. He seems to me to be equal, isos, like in the word isometric. He seems to me to be equal teoisin, to be equal to the gods. So that man I'm watching seems to me to be equal to the gods, or even, she later says in the next line, to surpass the gods. So what makes him equal to the gods or surpassing the gods? What makes him so lucky? Well, he's facing you. There's a relationship that we have with other human beings where we're face to face. And because that person is having that relationship of being face to face with you, he's equal to the gods. He has something that is beyond the human. at that moment. He seems to me to be equal to the gods, that man who facing you is seated, and up close, your sweet voice he hears. So there's the situation. Why is he so lucky? He gets to be face to face with you and hear your voice. And he also hears your laugh, you sweetly laughing. Then Sappho tells us what she feels. Why, it makes my heart flutter within my breast. Okay, so we get a little heart palpitations, a little speeding up of the heart in the breast. It makes my heart flutter within my breast because the moment I look at you, right then, for me, to make any sound at all won't work anymore. In other words, her own words get stuck in her throat as she watches the girl speaking to this other person. My tongue has a breakdown. And so my tongue won't work, my glossa won't work. And a delicate, sudden fire rushes underneath the surface of my skin. And you've had that feeling. That's that sense of an adrenaline rush that sends a flame down your limbs. Well, Sappho had that, watching this one who seems to be equal to the gods. So what have we got so far? I can't say anything. My tongue is swollen in my throat. The fire's rushing down my limbs. And then with my eyes, I see nothing. You ever feel that sense that you're almost going to go black out as your blood pressure rises in a situation like that? And there's a roar that my ears make. So we've got a little tinnitus roaring up here. Sweat pours down me, and a trembling seizes all of me. Paler than grass am I, and a little short of death do I appear to myself. And notice she says there at the end, do I appear to myself? So she's in fact then on the outside of herself looking at herself as she looks at him looking at her. Okay. Think about what Sappho stresses in this poem. It begins with finite. He seems, he appears. We're watching things moving in time, and we are watching our own reaction as it slips away, as we can't hold on to it, as the loss occurs. And it is sweet because we experience desire, we experience love, we experience the wonder of listening to this person talking and sweetly laughing. And at this very same time, we experience the piquant, that loss, that pain, that sharp piercing. That's Sappho's version.
Deep sea,